The Transporter 1 begins with Frank seated in the car. He played some music, put on his gloves, and drove off. He went to a building, and it turned out to be an office. He picked up his client, the robber, but he didn't leave the bank right away. He said that his client did not comply with the agreed rules. Initially, they said that there were 3, but in fact, there were actually 4. Frank explained that the addition of one person weighing 80 kilograms could make their plan fall apart. Frank installed shock absorption in his car, but it would probably be useless because of the extra weight, and they could easily get caught by the police. The robbers were annoyed that Frank talked too much and didn't leave the office immediately. A few moments later, the police arrived. He was afraid of being caught. The robbery leader shot one of his friends and let him fall in the backyard. Finally, there were only 3 robbers left in the car, and this was in accordance with the initial agreement. Frank cleverly tricked the police who were there. He drove his car at full speed. Then the police throughout the city chased Frank's car. On the way, one of the robbers got drunk, and Frank stopped so that the robber could throw up on the side of the road. The more the police chased, the harder it became for Frank to escape. They were stuck on a bridge in an alley, but Frank was able to escape the urgent situation. He crossed the bridge by crashing into the barrier. For a moment, the car floated and came down right on top of a truck that carried several cars. Frank opened the truck's door using a gun so that his car could get out of the truck. Then Frank managed to escape from the police chase. Frank stopped his car near a parked car. Then the robber gave him more money. He wanted Frank to drive him all the way to Avignon. However, Frank didn't accept the extra money. He did not want to drive them to Avignon because it was not in accordance with the agreement. The robbers were upset, and finally they left using the car that Frank had prepared. After he finished his work, Frank went home. He changed his license plate and washed his car. Then he watched the news on TV. He saw that his client was arrested by the police. Soon an inspector came to see him. The inspector talked about the kind of car Frank had, which was a BMW. The inspector said that many people who owned a 1999 black BMW 765 with license plate 06 were investigated by the police for robbery. Frank said that a recent robbery involved someone who was proficient at driving a 1999 black BMW 765. Then the inspector looked at Frank's garage from afar. He looked like he wanted to find something there, but the inspector chose to leave. Frank received a call from someone. The person needed a delivery driver. Frank met him at the bar. Frank asked about the details of the item he was going to deliver, such as the size of the bag and the weight of the item. He also asked for the pickup time and destination address. Frank told him the rules, such as he would only deliver the goods and was not responsible for any other disturbances other than delivering the goods to the destination. The client agreed to the agreement and rules. The next morning, he picked up the goods that he had to deliver to the destination. On the way, Frank's front tire went flat. He tried to replace it with a spare tire, but he got a surprise when he saw the bag and the baggage moving on its own. He continued his journey. Then he stopped to buy a drink. After a while of driving, he stopped again. He opened the bag that was to be delivered to the destination address. When he opened the bag, he got surprised because it contained a woman. Frank gave her a little drink and continued his journey. He heard the woman seem to be screaming. Then Frank stopped the car. He asked if there was a problem. The woman wanted to urinate. Frank regretted allowing her to get out of the baggage. It turned out that the woman tried to run away. Frank managed to catch her back. He saw 2 policemen around his car. He quickly fought off the 2 policemen and tied them up in the baggage. After a long journey, Frank arrived at his destination. He handed over the bag containing the woman to its owner. Frank did not say that he almost lost the contents of the bag. He immediately accepted the reward, but his client wanted to ask Frank to deliver an item. Frank continued his journey with an item and 2 policemen in his baggage. He stopped and got 2 drinks for the policeman. Suddenly, his car exploded. He was very angry. He went straight to the delivery address. When he arrived, he broke down the door of the house. He fought with several people in the house until he stole the car in the garage. It turned out that the woman he delivered earlier was hiding in the car. Knowing that Frank dropped her off in the middle of the road, He undid his intention to leave the woman in the middle of the road. He put her back in the trunk. Then Frank decided to take her home. When he got home, Frank made food for her. He asked her name. The woman's name was Lai. Then Frank untied Lay's feet and hands and let her stay in his house. Frank decided to sleep. Meanwhile, Lai looked for a place to sleep. She entered a room and accidentally found photos of Frank when he was a child and when he was part of the military. After seeing that, Lai went to sleep. At the hospital, Frank's client visited the thug who had been beaten by Frank. The thug said that Frank had beaten up his men, but he didn't believe it. He believed that Frank had gone up in flames with his car. Instead of believing his men, he killed him. The next morning, Frank met Lai, who was in the kitchen. Lai prepared coffee and tea for Frank. She also made Madeleine de Commerce, French sponge cake. Frank drank the coffee and ate Lai's cake. Then Lai took the milk in front of Frank's house. When she opened the door, she saw the inspector coming. Lai claimed that she was the chef at Frank's house. The inspector met Frank. He showed Frank the license plate of Frank's burnt car. Frank quickly said that his car had been stolen. He didn't know that the car had caught fire. The inspector asked Frank where he was at the time. Frank went to Fregis to get some things and his car just disappeared. He added that he chose to walk. Then Lai told him that he gave Frank a ride. The inspector was a little suspicious. He wanted to see Lai's car. After that, Frank showed him his car. The inspector thought the car was too expensive for a cook. Then the inspector left. Before leaving, he suggested Frank come to the police station to give further information. Frank and Lai entered the house. They argued. He said that he had a nightmare last night. Then he realized that the atmosphere around him was too quiet, unlike usual. Just moments later, several missiles destroyed Frank's house. Gunshots rained down on them. It turned out that the attack was carried out by a client who set his car on fire. Fortunately, Frank brought Lai to the lower floor. They entered a hole which turned out that it was connected directly to the sea. Frank calmed Lai, who was panicking and worried. After Lai calmed down, Frank and Lai swam to a place, and it turned out that they were heading to Frank's other house. Frank was upset with everything that had happened to him. He grumbled all the way to his room. He said he should have stuck to his business, not opening the package he was about to deliver. Seeing that, Lai tried to comfort Frank. Suddenly, he kissed Frank. Frank refused at first, but eventually they enjoyed it. Later that afternoon, Frank and Lai went to the police station. He reported that his house was on fire. The inspector asked where they were when the shots were fired. Lai and Frank said they went for a walk on the beach and then swam. They also stated that no one else but them was swimming at the beach. The inspector asked if any of the business partners wanted Frank dead, but he firmly replied that he was just a retired soldier who had no business. He assumed that those who destroyed his house were the wrong people, but the inspector said that it was impossible because 5,000 ammunition casings had been found in Frank's house. The inspector said that the people who destroyed his house could not be mistaken. Moments later, the inspector was called by his colleague. Meanwhile, Frank and Lai remained in the inspector's office. Lai immediately finds out the owner of the Mercedes-Benz that Frank picked up at his client's house after his car caught fire. She used the inspector's computer to search for data. Lai found the identity of the car's owner. Then Frank and Lai were let go home. The inspector gave them a place to stay, a motel owned by his cousin, but Frank refused. In addition, the inspector gave them money to eat because he knew Frank's house was destroyed by fire. Lai wanted to meet Frank's client, but Frank refused. Lai tried to persuade Frank. He said that his client had blown up his car. Frank said he would buy a new car. Lai said his client had also destroyed Frank's house. Then Frank replied that he would rebuild his house. Lai still insisted that the man had tried to kill Frank. Instantly, Frank stopped walking. He looked at Lai and said that he didn't want to know what had happened to Lai. He didn't know what trouble Lai had gotten into, but he insisted that Lai could start all over. Lai told Frank that her father and siblings were in a container that would arrive that day. Frank's client was going to make them slaves. Instead of expressing his sadness, Frank said that Lai was very good at using people. Frank explains that ever since Lai saw the photo of his past, he's been trying to frame Frank to get him involved in Lai's affairs. Then Lay said that not everything he did was a lie, one of which was the incident that happened at Frank's house when they were together. Hearing that, Frank was silent. Lay wanted Frank to help her. Then Lay said that Frank used to be a soldier who helped people. Frank felt tired if his hard work was not valued by others. Lay firmly said that he really appreciated Frank's hard work this time. They went to the man's office. They waited for him in his office. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Frank and Lay already in his office. Frank pointed a gun at him. He asked why he was trying to kill him. The man replied that Frank did not agree to the rules by opening the contents of the package he was carrying. Meanwhile, Lay was looking for a file containing the container number of 400 people. The man told Frank that Lay's father was not actually in the container. It turns out that Lay's father, Kwai, is the man's business partner. Mr. Kwai came to meet the man. Frank felt that Lay was lying to him. After that, Lay's father came to meet the man. Frank didn't expect Lay would lie to him again. Lay pointed a gun at his father, but her father managed to persuade her to put the gun down. Kwai's guards were able to make Frank fall unconscious. Soon the inspector saw Frank, who fainted. Then the police took Frank to the police station. Frank woke up from his stupor. He was being held in prison. The inspector was there when Frank woke up. The inspector asked Frank how he got involved with that person. The inspector wanted to get the right information. Frank told him that the man was smuggling 400 Asians in a container. The inspector didn't believe it. Frank added that Lay told him about it. A while later, Frank came out of the prison walking, pointing a gun at the inspector. The policemen were unable to beat Frank. Then Frank left for the harbor. He placed the inspector in the baggage of the car. When they arrived at the dock, Frank drove the boat to the harbor. When he arrived at the harbor, he saw many containers coming. He checked the contents of some containers with a stethoscope to find out the sound inside. Lay and her father monitored the arrival of the containers containing Asians. Frank's clients were also at the port. Frank saw them. Frank shot one of Kwai's men. Then Frank fought them off. Frank went to a parking lot at the port. He fought more than 5 thugs. Eventually, sometime later, Frank managed to defeat them. After he found out where the container was, Frank followed the truck carrying the container away from the port. On the way, his car broke down. He saw a small plane about to land. He ran to the place where the plane landed. Frank rented the small plane to chase after the container of Asians. Before he got off the plane, he asked the pilot to contact the inspector. After that, Frank descended on the container using a paraglider. Lay, Mr. Kwai, and his men saw Frank get off the plane. Mr. Kwai looked worried. Then Frank managed to get rid of the container driver. But when Frank drove the container truck, he was attacked by Mr. Kwai's men. However, Frank easily defeated him. After seeing that the surroundings were conducive, Frank stopped the container truck. However, it turned out that Mr. Kwai was pointing a gun at him. But soon, Mr. Kwai was shot. The person who shot him was his own daughter, Lay. Frank tried to calm Lay down. Then the inspector came. He praised Frank's ability. Finally, they opened the container and found out that there were indeed many people inside. The transporter, too, begins with Frank seated in a car. He was putting on his gloves. He was getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a woman knocked on his windshield. She asked Frank for help because her tire was flat, but Frank refused. The woman asked Frank if he would help her or die. The woman pointed her gun at Frank. Then she told Frank to get out of the car. After that, the thugs came to Frank. They got into Frank's car, but they couldn't start the car. Frank told them that the car would start if we entered the code. The thugs were upset. They got out of the car and attacked Frank. Frank defeated them one by one. The woman kept pointing a gun at Frank, but Frank wasn't afraid of her. Frank told the woman to leave. After that, Frank got into the car and left. Frank arrived in front of a school. He picked up a boy named Jack. The boy got into Frank's car. He sat with his feet up on the car seat. Frank talked about the rules that Jack had to obey. Jack said that he must respect the car. The second rule is that he must say hello. Jack then said hello to Frank. After that, Jack invited Frank to play. But Frank said that Jack must still be tired from school. But Jack said that it was Friday and he had no homework. Finally, Frank started the guessing game. Frank gave a clue that he was white and round but not always there. Jack replied that he was a tennis ball, but Frank said that tennis balls are yellow. Then Frank gave him a clue which was sometimes half, sometimes full, sometimes a piece you know. Jack said that it was bread, but Jack's answer was wrong. Frank continued his game. The next clue was sometimes light, sometimes dark, sometimes both. Jack answered the bulb, then pizza. Unfortunately, Jack's answer was still wrong. Frank arrived at Jack's house. Frank noticed that Jack's parents were arguing. He gave Jack one last clue before going out. The clue is that everyone wants to step on me, but only a few can. A few moments later, Audrey approached Jack. Jack told his mom that he was playing with Frank. Jack asked his mom to help him answer Frank's question. Then Audrey whispered that the answer was the moon. The answer was correct. Jack got out of Frank's car. Then Audrey talked to Frank. She felt that Frank was close to Jack this month. Frank also felt the same way. Audrey actually wanted Frank to work for Jefferson, her husband, but Frank couldn't do it. Then Audrey said that tomorrow she was supposed to take Jack to the doctor, but she had to prepare a surprise party for Jack's birthday. Frank said that he would take Jack to the doctor. As they talked, someone monitored their voice from the speaker. The speaker was hidden near Audrey's house. After that, Frank left Audrey's house. There was a car parked in front of Audrey's house. Inside the car was a man sitting in front of a computer screen. He was taking a call. He told him that there was a change of plans for tomorrow. Someone was practicing martial arts by the sea. Then a man approached him. He said that there was a change of plans for tomorrow morning. She went into the house to see Vasily. Vasily gave her a poison and an antidote. In the evening, Frank watched the news on TV. The news was that 6 Latin American drug unit ministers arrived in Miami for a meeting. Suddenly, Audrey came to Frank's house. She said that she was confused and felt lost. Audrey wanted to kiss Frank, but he refused because he felt inappropriate for Audrey. After a while, Audrey decided to go home. The next morning, 2 men and 1 woman came to the doctor's office that Frank and Jack were going to visit. The woman's name was Lola. The 3 of them entered and shot the nurse and doctor. Meanwhile, Frank and Jack had just arrived. They entered Dr. Coblin's room. Lola disguised herself as a nurse. She welcomed Frank and Jack. Frank said that he had an appointment with Dr. Coblin, but Lola said that he got sick with the flu. Jack was sad to hear that. Then Frank and Jack headed to room 1B. Suddenly, one of the thugs pretended to be a doctor named Dr. Tyberg. Jack said he wanted to be examined by Dr. Coblin, but he said that he was dealing with an emergency problem. Frank was a little suspicious of him. He said that the nurse said Dr. Coblin had the flu, not an emergency. Then the thugs said that the emergency was a cold. After that, Jack entered with the thugs. Frank wanted to accompany Jack, but he said that Frank could wait outside. A while later, Frank got a call from the inspector, who came from France. Just then, he heard Lola's conversation with someone on the phone. Lola said that Dr. Dunitz was absent today. Frank saw one of the thugs wearing a doctor's coat with Dr. Dunitz's name written on it. Frank felt that something was wrong. He hung up the phone from the inspector. Frank rushed to meet Jack. He attacked the 2 thugs. He tried to save Jack. Frank can easily fight them off. Lola, however, tried to shoot Frank. Frank managed to hide. He set a trap for Lola that made the building partially explode. Then Frank and Jack went to the elevator, but Lola found out about it. Frank and Jack managed to leave the place. Instantly, Lola called her friend who was in the parking lot. She delivered a code indicating that the mission had failed. Then the man put something on Frank's car. A few moments later, Frank left. Meanwhile, Lola left the building, waiting for Frank to pass the front. Frank gets past Lola without getting shot. Moments later, Lola called Gianni. She told him that Frank and Jack had escaped. Then Lola offered to run Plan B. Frank and Jack arrived in front of Audrey's building. Just as they were about to enter, Frank received a call from Gianni. He said that Frank had destroyed his plan. So Frank had to fix the broken plan. Then Lola arrived. With a heavy heart, Frank had to let Lola get in his car. Audrey saw the incident. She approached Frank's car, but Frank gestured for her not to approach his car. After that, Frank was forced to leave Audrey's house because Lola threatened him. There were many policemen chasing Frank, but Frank tried to trick them. He passed by the beach, the village, and also the parking lot in a building. Finally, he was able to avoid the police. Many police officers arrived at Audrey's house. One of them gave Frank a background file. The police thought that Frank could be involved in Jack's kidnapping plan. Audrey believed that Frank would not kidnap her son. In the afternoon, Frank arrived at a used car dump. Frank and Jack got out of the car. Janny came and met Frank in person. Janny called Jefferson. He told him to hand over $5 million in $100 bills. In 2 hours, Jefferson had to deliver the money in a waterproof suitcase. Then Jefferson had to go to Bayfront Park alone. Then Jefferson had to put the suitcase in the trunk of a parked blue Chrysler. Hearing that, Jefferson was confused. He said that he didn't know how to get $5 million in 2 hours, but Gianni felt that Jefferson must have that much money. Then Jefferson asked what the guarantee was that he wouldn't hurt Jack. Gianni said that if he passes 10 minutes, he will send 1 finger, 20 minutes 1 hand, 30 minutes 1 foot. Jefferson and Audrey were very worried about their son. After that, Jack was taken by one of Gianni's men. Jack said that Frank wouldn't let anyone hurt him. Gianni said that you shouldn't make promises if you can't keep them. Frank firmly replied that he would not break his promise. Gianni told Frank to leave, but Frank saw a bomb cable dangling under Frank's car. Soon Frank left by car, while Gianni and his men left by boat. When Lola wanted to blow up Frank's car, but he managed to release the bomb in his car. Then Frank called Jefferson, but U.S. Marshal Stapleton answered. Frank told him to act quickly using the plane because there were 3 ships heading north. Jefferson was angry with Frank. Frank decided to go back to his house. He called his friend who had just come from France. Frank told him to leave the house and go to Miami Beach. When Tarconi was about to leave the house, the police came and arrested him. After that, Frank called Audrey. He said that he was not involved in Jack's kidnapping. In addition, he told her what happened when he was at the doctor. Hearing that, Audrey cried. Tarconi was taken to the police station. He was asked why he didn't say that he was an inspector. Instead of answering, Tarconi expressed his amazement at the technological sophistication in Miami. He explained that he was not Frank's friend, but he knew Frank and was on good terms. Frank went to the building where the doctor worked. He entered the security room and copied the files. He entered the doctor's room and took an injection containing poison. The injection was brought by thugs to poison Jack. Suddenly, someone named Smith arrived. Smith told Frank to put down the injection, but unfortunately, the injection containing the poison was broken because it was shot by Smith's men. Frank beat Smith easily. Then he left the place. Jefferson went to Bayfront Park. He slowly put the suitcase into the trunk of the blue Chrysler. Frank called Tarconi, who was busy cooking for the U.S. Marshal. Frank was surprised that Tarconi could talk casually after being arrested by the police. Tarconi said that now they knew my position. They respected him. Then Frank sent Tarconi a photo of one of the thugs posing as a doctor. He told Tarconi to identify him. It turned out that the thug was a Russian biologist with a degree in biological warfare. Tarconi gave the thug's address in Miami, King Street number 11. After that, Frank told him about himself, who was in quite a complicated problem. After calling Tarconi, Frank went to the address of a thug named Dimitri. When Frank was in front of Dimitri's room, Frank saw him trying to escape. Frank chased after him. He ran through buildings, bridges, and also rode a jet ski in the sea. Finally, Frank was able to catch him. He asked what liquid was in the injection that would be given to Jack this morning. Dimitri didn't answer him. Frank injected the liquid into the thigh of the thug. But Frank knew for sure that the man's health would deteriorate because of the liquid Frank had injected. Audrey and Jefferson were worried about Jack's condition. Audrey blamed Frank because he became a famous person so that his family became the target of crime. Then they headed to where Jack was. Jack was locked in a truck. At first, the police used a tool to open the truck door, but the tool had a problem. Audrey couldn't wait to see that. She got out of the car. Audrey opened the truck door. It was true that Jack was inside the truck. Then Audrey and Jefferson hugged Jack. Frank continued to chase Dimitri. until Dmitri went to a place like a laboratory with patients. Frank followed him secretly. Dmitri met someone there. He asked about Sonovich's whereabouts, but the man told Dmitri to sit down because Sonovich was inside. Frank looked around for a while. He saw several people lying on the bed like a patient. When he was about to take a closer look at one of the patients, he was surprised because a big man appeared. He beat Frank first, until Frank fell to the floor below. But Frank was not desperate, until finally Frank managed to beat him. Dmitri and Tipov heard the noise caused by Frank's fight. Dmitri immediately went to Sonovich to ask for an antidote to the virus. But there are only 2 doses for Sonovich and Tipov. Then Dmitri shot Tipov. He said that 2 doses were enough for Dmitri and Sonovich. Before Sonovich could inject the antidote, Frank arrived. He says that Frank injected Dmitri with water instead of the virus liquid. Then Frank kills Dmitri. Dmitri urges Sonovich to explain about the virus. Sonovich said that it was a double mutated waste liquid. He added that the affected person breathes dead. Then the virus would stop after 24 hours, he added. Suddenly Sonovich threw 2 tubes of antidote out the window. Frank immediately jumped out of the window. But unfortunately, Frank only got 1 tube intact. Then Frank returned to his car. He replaced his torn and wet shirt with a new shirt that was in the trunk of his car. Then Frank went to Audrey's house. Frank called Audrey. Audrey didn't know that Frank was nearby. Audrey looked happy to see Frank. She immediately hugged him. Frank told her that Jack had a virus that could spread through breathing. Frank brought an antidote for the virus, so Audrey didn't have to worry. He injected the medicine into Jack and Audrey. Afterward, Frank said that Jefferson going to a conference could cause the virus to spread further. On the outside of the house, one of the policemen noticed the broken glass. He realized that someone had broken in. When Frank came out of Jack's room, he was surrounded by several policemen. Jack manages to fight them off. Jefferson arrived at the conference center. Audrey called him to tell him that Jefferson couldn't attend the event because he was exposed to the virus and it could make the virus spread further. Sadly, Jefferson couldn't hear her clearly. Jefferson went ahead with the conference. Frank called Tarconi, who was still at the Miami police station. Tarconi knew that Frank needed his help. Frank told Tarconi to find something about this case. Then he got the identity of a man named Gianni. He told Frank that Gianni worked for anyone who looked for trouble like the Red Brigade. Then Tarconi gave Gianni's home address to Frank. The police realized that someone was accessing data from the 15th floor. The police checked who was accessing the computer. Meanwhile, Frank saw that there were police patrolling looking for Frank. Then Frank escaped and left in a taxi. The next day, Gianni wanted to transfer the antidote to his body because he wanted it to be unbreakable. Frank suddenly barged into Gianni's house. Gianni knew about it. Gianni's men fired at the taxi Frank was driving. Frank escaped to Gianni's garage. It turned out that in the garage a lot of Gianni's men were carrying weapons to fight Frank. Some carried axes, iron pipes, and others. Frank couldn't resist the urge to fight them all. Frank took out the moves he mastered. He finally defeated them. Then Frank wanted to go to the stairs to enter Gianni's house. But again, he was blocked by some of Gianni's men. Frank was still able to easily defeat them. Frank just used a fire extinguisher pipe wrapped around their body parts. Frank arrived inside Gianni's house. He tried to arrest him. But Lola fought Frank. Meanwhile, Gianni left using helicopter. After Frank defeated Lola, he left by car to follow Gianni's helicopter. Eventually, Gianni arrived at the airport. He got into his private plane. Meanwhile, Frank kept chasing Gianni. Finally, Frank got into Gianni's plane through the front wheel of the plane. Gianni wanted to shoot Frank, but Frank dropped Gianni's gun. Then finally, they fight on the plane. Gianni accidentally shot the pilot. This caused the plane to rise, fall, and spin. Frank and Gianni kept fighting in such a situation. Moments later, the plane crashed into the sea. Frank helped Gianni to get out of the plane and swam. Then they managed to survive. On the surface of the sea, the police had come to meet them. After Frank survived, he visited Jack, Audrey, and also Jefferson at the hospital. Actually, Frank wanted to give flowers to Audrey, but he saw the three of them laughing in the room. Then he abandoned his intention to visit them. He chose to leave the flowers to the nurse. After that, Frank returned to his car. He drove Tarconi to the airport to return to France. Shortly after he got into his car, Frank got a call from someone. The person said that he needs a transporter. Transporter 3 begins with two crew members who walked through a ship filled with many containers. They looked for containers that contained bottles of liquor. There were two men inside a large ship. The first man took a piece of paper containing a weather forecast report. He gave the paper to the second man, the captain. Meanwhile, the captain was monitoring the sea using binoculars. Then the two crew members on the lower part of the ship had found a container that was suspected to contain the goods he was looking for. When they opened the container, they smelled a strong odor coming from inside. They walked in, looking for the item they had to take. But when they opened the big barrel, they were shocked to see that it was filled with an unpleasant-smelling liquid. They decided to get out, but unfortunately, they died from inhaling the liquid. On board, the vice captain noticed signs of trouble in the lower part of the ship. He reported the problem to the captain. Then the captain immediately went to the lower ship. Arriving there, the captain ordered his members to wear masks. They searched for the source of the problem. They found two crew members dead with blisters on their faces. The other crew members finally threw their bodies overboard. Then a car came out of a ship that had just docked. In the car, there was one man and one woman. They left Ibiza and entered Marseille. Frank and Tarconi sat in a boat. They went fishing. Unfortunately, they didn't get any fish, until Tarconi fell asleep while waiting for the fish to eat his bait. The men who had just arrived in Marseille had to pass a document check by the police. They passed the first check. During the second check, the driver of the car chose to run away from the document checkpoint. The police chased the speeding Audi. Tarconi woke up from his sleep. He noticed that his fishing rod was moving, indicating that a fish had been hooked. But unfortunately, the fish escaped Tarconi's fishing rod. Moments later, Tarconi got a call from the French police. Then Tarconi said that their vacation should stop here. Tarconi was informed that someone was driving an Audi at high speed. Therefore, he would have to go back to work. But Tarconi invited Frank to solve the problem, because Tarconi knew that Frank was an expert in solving such problems. At a French Air Force airport, Johnson's private plane arrived. Then Johnson had to pass a document check. Johnson said that the purpose of coming to France was for a business trip in the field of environmental protection. Then there was Leonid, who met the journalists already waiting for him in his office. One of the journalists asked the purpose of the EU press conference to be held in Odessa. He said it was about the environment and how to protect it. After he felt enough interviews with the journalists, he decided to go into his office. He found an envelope containing a cell phone. A few moments later it rang. Leonid picked up the phone. Then a man watched him from afar. It was Johnson. Johnson said that he found evidence of negotiations between Leonid and EcoCorp. The evidence was that Leonid allowed them to do business in Ukraine, but he denied the allegations. Leonid firmly said that he had canceled the agreement permanently. But Johnson told Leonid to open an envelope containing a document. The man said that he was watching Johnson from afar. In the evening, Frank watched TV at home. He was already in France. Suddenly, the Audi that the police had been looking for all morning now crashed into Frank's house. The driver was badly injured. Frank called an ambulance and told it to come to Frank's place. He found out the man's identity. The man's name was Malcolm. Instantly, Frank remembered about Malcolm. It turned out that Malcolm was Frank's old partner. A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They were preparing to take Malcolm to the hospital. Then Frank found a woman who slept the back car seat. Frank tried to get her out of the car, but the woman refused. She said that she couldn't be away from the car, while showing the bracelet on her hand. Frank realized that it could cause an explosion. He ran after the ambulance carrying his friend Malcolm. Unfortunately, the ambulance was already quite far from Frank's house. Soon after, the ambulance exploded. Then Frank approached the woman in the car. When he turned around, someone hit Frank in the face and knocked him unconscious. Frank woke up. He was in a room that was certainly not his home. He realized that there was a bracelet attached to his hand. The bracelet was exactly the same as the one Malcolm was wearing. A few moments later, Johnson came to see him. He forced Frank to carry out an important mission. At first, he didn't want to take the job. However, Frank knew he was out of luck because he had a bracelet on his hand that could explode at any time. So, Frank took the job on the condition that he drove his own car. Johnson explained that Frank's car had been modified. Johnson removed the unnecessary things and replaced the bad ones with better ones. Johnson warned that the bracelet could make him explode if Frank was 75 meters away from the car. After that, Frank got into the car. But there was a woman he met at his house. Her name was Valentina. Seeing her sitting in the car seat, Frank said that he wanted to work alone without her. Johnson was about to shoot Valentina. Frank stopped him. Then Frank reluctantly did his job accompanied by Valentina. Johnson gave him a cell phone that could only call one number, Johnson. Then Johnson also gave money to buy gas and food. Frank started his journey. On the way, he asked Valentina to explain what happened. But she was silent. Frank was so upset with her. Tarkani came to Frank's house. He didn't know what was going on with Frank. He told his men to start investigating the case involving Frank and Malcolm. Leonid felt confused and uneasy because Johnson had found out that he was negotiating with ECO Corp. Then a truck driver carrying Malcolm's car stopped his truck. He saw a car blocking his way. Instantly, Leonid's men shot him, then took the GPS on the dashboard of Malcolm's car. Frank continued his journey. He tried to recognize Valentina, but she didn't want to say her name. Frank asked how she knew Malcolm. Valentina said that she didn't recognize him. Frank didn't believe that. But Valentina scolded him because she didn't know Malcolm like he didn't know her. Then Frank called Johnson and asked for the code to find out the address where the package was sent. It turned out that Frank had to send the package to Budapest, Hungary. A few minutes later, Frank stopped his car. He asked Valentina to meet him nicely and politely, but she still wouldn't tell him her name. Frank gave up. Then he continued his journey. After a while, Frank continued on his way. Valentina suddenly mentioned his name. Frank was relieved to hear that. He shook Valentina's hand and said it was nice to meet her. Tarkani went to the scene where the truck driver was shot. He checked the camera on the truck. He saw that two men came up to the driver and one of them shot him. Tarkani also saw the person take the GPS in Malcolm's car. At Leonid's office, representatives from ECO Corp arrive. They gave him an employment contract. They said that they ordered people not to lift the cargo of their ships until Leonid agreed to the contract. Leonid was quiet for a moment. He asked why there were so many ships. ETO Corp explained that they needed a lot of materials to make a lot of profit. The number of ships used was 8, he added. Then Leonid decided to sign the contract tomorrow in Odessa. He wanted to review the proposal that ECO Corp had made. The captain of the ship called ECO Corp and told them that he could not continue to hide ECO Corp's goods because the liquid had spread. Leonid contacted his men who were following Frank and Valentina. Leonid warns his men that their time ends tomorrow morning. Tarkani identified Malcolm's car, but his partner showed him a picture of a car speeding towards Wardorf. Tarkani knew it had to be Frank, so he immediately went to look for him. On the way, Valentina wanted to eat, but she doesn't like German sausages. Frank asked her what her favorite food was. She said that she liked veal for the main course, salad for appetizer, sachertorte for dessert, and cold wine for her drink. Frank agreed to Valentina's request. Then he turned down the street he wasn't supposed to be on. He wanted to find out about the bracelet they were wearing. Instantly, Johnson's men knew that Frank was going the wrong way. Johnson told the other men to look for Frank. Frank went to see his friend Otto. Frank showed Otto the bracelet he was wearing. Otto explained that there was a program funded by the Pentagon through a subsidized company that was conducting research experiments on new technology weapons like the bracelet Frank was wearing. Then Otto checked Frank's car. Not long after, Johnson's men arrived. There are many of them, and even the biggest one. At first, Frank was confused about which person to start the fight with. But one of Johnson's men jumped up and tried to kick Frank. He easily brushed him off and broke his leg. Then the other thugs began to surround Frank. They carried weapons, but Frank defeated them one by one. Then came the last of Johnson's men. He was the biggest among the others. At first, Frank was confused because the man was very big, tall, and strong. However, Frank was no less ingenious. He climbed the big barrel in Otto's repair shop, so Frank became taller than the man. Then Frank trapped him so that he fell and stuck his foot in the hole. Frank easily beat him to death. Valentina watched how Frank fought. She admired Frank. She even told Frank directly that Frank fought well. Otto found the transmission plate in Frank's car. Frank told him to unplug it. But Otto said that if he pulled the transmission plate cable, Frank would explode. After that, Frank continued his work. He got a call from Johnson. Frank said he was not amused by the arrival of his men. Then Johnson said that Frank would be entertained if he was the one who died. Of course, Frank firmly replied that Johnson needed Frank to get the job done, so Johnson wouldn't let Frank die. Johnson just kept quiet. Frank continued his journey until he finally arrived in Budapest, Hungary. He stopped in the middle of the market. He heard a public phone ringing. He needed to answer it. Then he left his car. The call was from Johnson. He said that Frank was fired from the job. He was silent for a moment and looked at his car. Then a man got in and drove Frank's car. Frank was so panicked because he remembered Johnson's words that if he was away from the car, it would explode. Frank chased after his car. He ran in the middle of the crowded market. Then he rode a bicycle. Frank even entered a factory in order to stop the car. Finally, he got his car back. Frank called Tarconi on a public phone. He said that he was in trouble. Tarconi guessed that Frank had some business in Hungary. Then Frank asked what information he could get. Tarconi replied that he was looking for a black Mercedes car in Budapest, Hungary. Then Frank said that he got an assignment to send 2 bags in his trunk. Frank also added that he got a bracelet that could blow himself up if he moved away from his car. Then Tarconi asked Frank to tell his whereabouts. Then Frank called Johnson. Frank wants their cooperation to start again. At that moment, Tarconi tracked Johnson's location. After that, Frank continued his journey to Bucharest. But on the way, Valentina took drugs. Then Frank stopped at a gas station to refuel his car. Besides that, Valentina stopped by the shop there. Frank saw a black Mercedes car stopped near the gas station. Frank felt suspicious about the car. Then Valentina went back to the car. The people in the black Mercedes realized that Valentina was outside the car. Frank immediately put her in his car. Frank saw the black Mercedes heading towards him. Frank immediately drove his car fast. They chased Frank, but Frank managed to stay out of the way of the shots fired at him. Finally, Frank defeated them because he pushed the car into the ravine. After that, Frank stopped. He felt tired of this mission. Valentina tried to make him relax, but actually she wanted to make love to Frank. Frank refused at first, but Valentina teased him. She grabbed Frank's car keys. Frank had to comply with her wishes so that he could take the keys from Valentina. They finally did it. Johnson was worried because he couldn't track Frank's location. Then he called Leonid. Johnson warned him not to tell his men to obstruct Johnson's mission. Leonid was very worried about his daughter, Valentina. Frank and Valentina were still in the mountains. They talked to each other. Valentina explained how she came to this. She said that someone set her up. She mentioned that she was drunk and woke up in a car, which was Malcolm's car. Malcolm carried out a mission like Frank did, until Malcolm finally tried to escape from the job. But when they ran away, someone shot him. Then he decided to go to Frank's house because Frank was his friend, she added. Suddenly Johnson called. He asked about Frank's whereabouts. Then he told Frank to go to Odessa, not Bucharest. Meanwhile, Tarconi met Leonid, who was going to the EU conference. Tarconi told Leonid to contact Johnson. At that moment, Tarconi was able to track Johnson's location. Frank got a call from Tarconi. He said that this mission would be completed soon. Frank also said that this mission must be 100% successful and make sure no one beats Frank up again. Then Johnson called Frank. He told Frank to go in the direction he told him. Eventually, he arrived at the bridge. Frank's car is surrounded by Johnson's men's cars. Johnson told Frank to deliver Valentina to him. But Valentina refused to go. Frank tried to convince him. Frank also felt afraid to give Valentina to Johnson's hands, because Frank and Valentina have felt comfortable with each other. Valentina reluctantly left Frank's car. Then Johnson took off the bracelet that was on Valentina's hand. After he got Valentina, he ordered his men to shoot Frank's car to kill him. However, Frank chose to jump into the lake under the bridge. Frank called Tarconi for help. Frank tried to save himself and his car to get out of the lake. Meanwhile, Tarconi went straight to the lake where Frank was referring to. Johnson waited for news and confirmation of Leonid signing the contract. While waiting, he took Valentina to go by train. When Tarconi arrived at the lake Frank was referring to, he frantically searched for him on the surface of the lake, but it turned out that Frank and his car were already on land. Tarconi felt glad and relieved to see that. Then Tarconi helped him so that Frank's car could run. After that, Frank decided to meet Valentina, who was on the train with Johnson. A few moments later, Frank found the train. Valentina saw Frank's car not far from her. Valentina looked very happy. Then Frank chased after her. Frank crashed into the bridge barrier to get on the train. Then he searched for Valentina. He fought Johnson's men easily. In the end, Frank defeated Johnson. Frank took the key to open his bracelet on Johnson's arm. Then Frank managed to remove the bracelet. He put the bracelet on Johnson's hand. Johnson looked panicked. Then Frank started the car so Johnson could get off the train. However, Johnson chose to untie his hands that were in Frank's car. Soon the car of Frank and Johnson exploded. Valentina and Frank are very glad and grateful that they are reunited. Leonid waited for good news from Tarconi. Because the time was already 9 a.m., and he had not received any information from Tarconi. He signed a contract with ECO Corp. Shortly afterward, Tarconi called him and told that Valentina was safe. Leonid didn't hesitate to tear up the paper of the agreement with ECO Corp. The water police chased the ship containing ECO Corp's poisonous waste. The captain and crew tried to escape, but the police managed to catch them. The next day, Frank and Tarconi are spotted sitting together on a boat. They waited for the fish to eat the bait from their fishing hooks. Tarconi said that he and his father used to fish in that sea. Frank replied that the world had changed. Tarconi agreed with Frank. He also said that Frank had changed. Frank was evasive at first, but he smiled because a few moments later, Valentina woke up from her sleep. She also went on vacation with Frank.